Hello, this is Helen Griffin from Golden Apple's webpage, and I've extended my cast-on list to include bind-offs as well, because there's often questions about how to bind off. I've done some knitting, and we're going to use this knitting as a sample of how to bind off. Now, one of the first questions is, how much yarn do I need to bind off? Well, one general rule is, I'm going to put down here so we can see it, is if you need approximately 3 times the length, gently placed on the needle, 3 times the length to do a row of knitting. That's a general rule. And for a bind off, you need 4. So let's see how well this works as a general rule. So I'm going to just put a little slip knot in here, and we're going to eventually bind off this row. Now, there are a number of bind offs, and the first one I'm doing is what I'm going to call a standard bind off, which is the most common bind off, I think, in Europe, the United States, Canada. And it's a very simple bind off to do. Oh, I've mapped this stitch wrong. Let's turn the stitch right. And basically, what you do is you knit a stitch, knit a second stitch. Be sure to keep these stitches loose. Lift the first stitch over the second. And repeat. Knit a stitch. So there are 2 on the right hand needle. Put the first over the second. Knit a stitch. Pull over. And the looser you do this, obviously, the looser and stretchier your bind off will be. Knowing you have planned ahead and you have enough yarn is one way to make sure that you end up doing this nice and loose and stretchy. So we're going to just continue. The method is fairly simple. Lift and go. Oops. It's a little harder when you're doing it through the viewfinder of the camera instead of actually looking at what your hands are doing. So we want to have a nice loose bind off, and we do this by intentionally keeping our stitches loose. The looser we keep them, the looser the bind off. So it's a fairly straightforward method of binding off. But there are 2 variations to this method of binding off, and let's do the first variation. The first variation is the same bind off, only we're going to work in purl stitches. So we're going to work in purl stitches, and again, do the same bind off. Purl a stitch, pull the first stitch over the second stitch, keeping the work loose, purl a stitch, bind off, purl a stitch, bind off. And again, you'll notice I'm intentionally keeping my needles far apart, stretching the yarn out, stretching the stitch out, because I want to have a nice loose bind off, because there's nothing that ruins a piece of knitting nearly so well as having a tight bind off that causes a barrel effect, where the bottom is smaller, the bottom, the cast on, and the bind off are narrower than the knitting as a whole, which looks like a barrel, which is usually narrow at the bottom, narrow at the top. Okay, so those are the second variations. There's a third variation that I'm going to do, and that is called a knit and purl. This is most commonly used, I'd say, for ribbing or seed stitch or anything else. And you can do knit 2, purl 2. I'm going to, for these purposes, use a single knit 1, purl 1 bind off. So I'm going to knit a stitch and bind it off. I'm going to purl a stitch and bind it off. I'm going to bring the yarn back, knit a stitch. Now, obviously, I knit with the yarn in my left hand, but to be quite honest, this is the sort of thing that it really doesn't matter how you form the stitches, only that the stitches are loose. And doing this English style with the yarn in the right hand would be virtually identical, because the only thing that's really changing is how the stitches are being formed. The idea is we're forming 2 stitches, crossing the first stitch over. That last one was a purl, so this next one needs to be a knit. And I wanted to do these 3 variations to show you what they do to the edge, because the cast-on edge does change. Oh, the bind-off edge does change depending on whether you knit them, or you purl them, or you work them in pattern, and or duplicate. So I feel now with my fingers that I am coming up to my little loop there. So at the beginning I said you need at least 4. Clearly I need more than 4. Now I am intentionally working loose, and this makes a difference, but clearly 4 is not going to be enough. I'm 2, 4, 6, 7 stitches short. So I'm going to pull this out and keep this as a reminder. That last one was a knit, so this next one's going to be a purl. I just want to finish these stitches off and show you the difference, because there is a difference in the result. You'd think knitting and purling might be the same, and the results are going to be the same whether you're working on something like this, which is a garter stitch, or whether you're working on a stockinette or a ribbing. The difference that I'm going to demonstrate in 2 stitches is going to be something that's going to hold over a wide range of knitting. So let's do this last one. I'm not going to cut the yarn and bind off, but normally about now that's what you'd do, is you'd cut the tail of the yarn, leaving a 6 or 8 inch tail, and pass that last bit of yarn through the stitch. Now what I want to show you is the first ones that I bound off were bound off in knitting, and you can see the chain stitch that is formed by a standard bind off. It's rolling ever so slightly to the front. Then I did some stitches in purl, and if I turn the work you'll see that I have the beautiful chain, but it's rolling towards the back of the work. And then I did some stitches in knit and purl, and it neither rolls to the front nor the back, but sits proud on top of the work. And so depending on where you want your bind off, do you want it rolling to the front, rolling to the back, or do you want it standing proud? How you bind off will make a difference. Many times it makes a very subtle and small difference, but sometimes it's an important difference. So it's something to keep in mind when working a standard bind off, that it does make a difference if you work to bind off in knit, in purl, or in pattern.